Then, after the war, of course, I was born, and then things I don't know too much what went on because I was pretty little. I don't remember too much about that. But the next big thing was in about 1946. I think my father bought a bulldozer, and he dug cellar holes and did excavating with the bulldozer. I know he plowed some snow in Middlefield with it. Uh, they and he had the bulldozer for 2 or 3 years, and he worked nights in the GE. I know that, and he ran the bulldozer most every day. And then towards the end, he had Leon Gardner and Chuck Vreeland. They ran the bulldozer during the days sometimes. Yeah. Uh, and he was, so then it got to a point where it was either go full time with the bulldozer, which was pretty hard going, really. It's a hard way to make a living compared to being a tool maker. Tool maker's easy, yeah, and it's inside. But no, but he decided he sold the bulldozer, and he sold the bulldozer to Raymond Roberts. And the Robertses, he had done a lot of work for Raymond's father, Reaney, who built homes out in Pittsfield. And up in Lanesboro, there were many places that he dug the cellar holes for, and did the excavation work. Then he sold the bulldozer, I believe, around 1950 or 51, so something like that. In that time period, still working for the GE, but he made the decision that I was going to go to Dalton High School. They were going to the city where I would get supposedly a better education. Apparently, there was some animosity about Chester High School because being from Middlefield, you were a hillbilly. And when you went down there, down to the big city of Chester, you weren't as well thought of as you might be. And I think that kind of stuck in his memory all his life. Not that it would have made any difference to me at that point. I think Chester High School would have been fine. But anyway, we moved. I was 11 years old when we moved out of Middlefield. I went to this very building. I went to school up until the 7th grade. And then we moved to Dalton. And we lived in Pittsfield, but I was sent to Dalton School for that year because they didn't want to change schools on me after. I wouldn't go to Pittsfield School and then go to Dalton. So we changed. We went to. I went to Dalton Junior School at that point. But in the meantime, my father had bought a lot in Dalton up off of Grange Hall Road on Audrey Drive. There was a new development going in there. Chet Dodge, a fellow from Peru, was building this. He was going to develop the street there. So my father actually bought 2 lots and proceeded in 1954 to start building his house. And it was a colonial style home. And that took about a year and a half to build the house, but we moved into it before it was finished, and we worked on it. I have pictures of myself. I helped him. I was 11 and 12 years old and working on worked on the construction. When he got the house built, this is around 1954, he had always wanted to have his own business. So he bought what is called a Gorton milling machine. And he had a couple of other machine tools, a lathe and a hacksaw and that type of thing. Excuse me. And he started down in the basement. He started a tool shop, a little building parts and pieces and molds for some of the tool shops and mold shops in the Pittsfield area. At that point, I was in high school, and I used to go down there and fool around, play with the toys, the machines, and did some work with them. Was able to maybe saw some stock off and that type, and it got me interested in it. And he did that all the time I was in high school. I know he was working down in the basement nights, Saturdays, Sundays, and kept buying more machinery. And the cellar is now pretty full of tool making machines, of millers and grinders and all kinds of stuff. When I finished high school in 1960, I remember I was just coming back up. We had double sessions, so he would come home from lunch. At this point, he was not working at the GE Plastics had closed, but he stayed here and went into methods and time study. So he was starting to get into the management side of the GE. So he reluctantly, he was not a real, he was more of the blue collar working guy, but he was coming, I was on double sessions and I was coming up the road. I had my little car at that point. I had a 1949 Chevrolet. I'm coming up the road and he's coming down and he pulls his car right in front of me, so I couldn't get up the road. And he gets out of the car, and this is in April of the year I'm graduating from high school, and he walks up and he says, "What are you going to do next year?" I don't know, typical 17-year-old. He says, "Well, they're having an open house at Wentworth," and he says, we're going to go down to that, and you take a look at the school." Well, my grades in high school were not what you would call very spectacular. I got through it, but barely. So anyway, we went down to Wentworth to the open house, and we went through and talked to one of the counselors there. And so they said, "Well, let's see." I said, "Well, I think I flunked chemistry." They said, "Well, you probably wouldn't need chemistry. Let's see what the other things you did." "Well, let's see, math, not too bad. English, you were pretty good. I think you can probably get in." So I applied and got accepted into the machine work course, and but all because my father made a point that, what am I going to do? I was probably going to join the Navy or something like that, but he insisted that I go look at that, and rightly so. It worked out well. When I finished Wentworth, he was still working at the GE, but now he was the manager of the ordnance tool room in the GE ordnance system, which is now owned by General Dynamics, I believe. So he was manager of the tool room, and it was a really good job for that at that time. So I went to work at Marlin Mold, and I worked there, and I finished the apprentice course there. I didn't have to take any of the study part of it because I had graduated from Wentworth, and so then after I finished that, I went to work over at Ordnance. It was during the Vietnam War, and I was exempted because at that point I had gotten married, and but my father was the manager of the ordnance tool room over there. So we had this machine shop in the basement that I was working at it part-time, and he was working at it part-time, and I finally, in 1967, I said, "Well, why don't I go full-time into this?" And he owned controlling interest of the business. And I said, "Then you can stay at the GE," and because here he is, he had 30-something years at the GE at that point. He certainly didn't want to leave. So I went full-time in 1967 in this little tool shop, and I'm sure it put a lot of gray hair on his head thinking about me being in there in that thing alone, 24 years old, off doing this thing. 2 children. I already had 2 children at that point. But anyway, we started it, and as we went along, we picked up more people. I think after the first year, we had something like 7 or 8 people working for us. Here again, my father was in there nights, Saturdays, Sundays, building this business with us, and I had 2 other partners also. We took on 2 other young fellows that I had known who were tool makers, and one was a designer. And we grew the business for 10 years. By the time we bought another building out in West Pittsfield, and as I say, my father still worked at the GE, and he worked for the GE up until he was 60 years old. But nights, Saturdays, Sundays, he was at Appalachian Engineering, which was the name of our company. And Appalachian, in 1980, he was 65, and we got talking about, he was kind of wanted to actually totally retire from working, which was kind of a misnomer. He never was going to really retire from anything. He was too active a person. But in 1980, we sold the business to a company called Comerix out of Woburn, Mass. And I was much too young to retire. I was only 38. But he had controlling interest in it, so it made a good retirement for him to get the money out of that business. Because at that point we had 30 people, and we were employing 30. We did the plastic injection molding and the machine shop too. And from there, he pretty much retired. There's a lot of things he did after he retired. He was a bit of an entrepreneur as far as developing and inventing things. And there's several things that he kind of invented. One of them was back much earlier, was in 1951 when he was still at the General Electric. They patented a right angle head for this Keller that he ran for. It was used to cut out corners in steel. He held the patent on that along with General Electric, of course. When you worked for GE, they owned part of the patent. But he did get some money out of that. But then after he retired, he developed what was known as the 2-stage flush valve for the toilet. You'd hit the lever once, and it would just flush the thing a little bit. You hit it twice, and it flushed the whole thing. And I still have some of them upstairs in my barn. I probably should give one to the Historical Society. That would be one thing they could have. He also, well, back early on, when I was probably 4 or 5 years old, he built a Jeep. It was from a picture from Popular Mechanics. That the Jeep, it looked like a little Jeep made out of plywood with a metal hood, and you lifted the hood and the battery sat in there, and then there was a starter motor that ran a gear that ran against the tire, against a gear that turned the tire. And you could charge the battery and it would run all day, and I would ride it around the yard, and ride it up to George Ols's store with my mother walking. It would go about as fast as you could walk. But then my father, my uncle, and 2 more friends, I think Steve Albro and Frank Halliman, the 4 of them decided they'd take a ride in it one day, and they got in it and they broke the wheel on it. 4 big men in there. I don't know what they were up to.